let's chat about the news, the unfortunate passing of Hossein Khosrow Vasiri, better known as the Iron Sheik. The news was made through his official Twitter account with a statement issued that he had passed away at the age of 81, no cause of death revealed. But this is somebody that had gone through, tumultuous issues in his life, not just personal tragedy that he suffered, but also drug addiction. He was in financial peril at different times, but just seeing like this is another one way that when you're talking about those figures that made their popularity in that 80s national expansion boom, it resonates with such an audience. And you saw that today with the level of mainstream coverage this got. And this was, I don't know how best to describe Iron Sheik other than he was a larger than life pro wrestling character that played it to the tilt. And so many people remember this character as the evil foreign adversary of Hulk Hogan and Sergeant Slaughter later. Just a very memorable character in professional wrestling. And I mean, has a really incredible life story when you go beyond just the character.
Certainly, yeah. Somebody who I think always felt like a character, whether or not he was inside the wrestling ring. And for various reasons, I think that becomes incredibly interesting to study. I certainly was not watching wrestling when he was sort of in his prime, I guess you could say. And really it took place, I think, before maybe, the majority of current wrestling fans probably were watching wrestling. But nonetheless, the man has managed to stay relevant somehow, just maybe through the sheer force of his personality. Obviously for his accomplishments in ring as well, but I would say maybe even outside of it, has just always been a presence to me.
Yeah, I mean, grew up in Iran and came over to the US, like got out of the country and, just pursued a desire to compete in Greco-Roman wrestling. And, there's, not to the extent of an Andre the Giant, but there is a lot of fiction attached to the Iron Sheik, and the origin of such is probably, I mean, you can go into different origin stories of where some of these came, but I mean, the guy never won an Olympic gold medal or competed at the Olympics, but nonetheless, he was an AAU champion in Greco-Roman wrestling. And did go as an assistant coach at at the Munich games. And then it was through Vern Gagne, who was involved with the, helping to fund the U.S. men's team, that he got into professional wrestling. And Vern Gagne churned out so many headliners out of Minnesota. And Khosrow was involved in the same class as Ric Flair in the camp where Ric Flair quit and then was brought back. And when you go and see photos of him in the 70s, I mean, this guy, it blows your mind to see photos of this guy who was like a really good wrestler before, his body broke down and it was more so just the Iron Sheik that most people would be familiar with. But he started out training in 1972 and then gets his start, and he is going to a lot of territories. Like he went to Mid-South in his first year, was going under various names. It wasn't until later in his career that he adopted the Iron Sheik persona. But here's a shot that Way has. I mean, here it is, the future winner of the gimmick battle royal. I mean, the man, like, look at that six pack. I mean, he had a totally different look to him in his early days, but he goes to Florida, he goes to Mid-South. I mean, he's going all over, but not all that different from superstar Billy Graham, who we just talked about. It's New York that he gains his largest fame, and it's sort of on the heels of the Iranian hostage situation, which occurred over 444 days, where the government had taken U.S. prisoners hostage, and that lasted from late 79 until early 81. So you can imagine what the national sentiment was towards Iran at the time, and it's sort of playing into, at its most cavalier, the stereotypes in professional wrestling and leaning on heavy xenophobia that was prevalent at this point. And the Iron Sheik, seeing that this is a great source for a heel character, and that certainly did resonate with the audience. He first goes to New York in 79, and he wins a battle royal and challenges Bob Backlund. And that was sort of a forgotten match he had with Backlund, losing to him. And then it's when he comes back for the big run in late 83, where he just comes out of nowhere. He is plopped onto a Madison Square Garden card in November, wins, and then the next month he beats Bob Backlund and ends his big title run. So it goes from superstar Billy Graham to Bob Backlund. And Backlund, I mean, he had some phantom title switches, but largely, like if you were in New York, you saw this guy for 5 years hold the title, and Iron Sheik beats him, and it was in shocking fashion that he wins. And it's a very heated match that you can watch where and they would play this like years later with Bob Backlund's comeback, where the towel is thrown in, and there's Freddie Blassie as the manager. And the original like announcement was that Iron Sheik would face Backlund in a rematch the next month. And then it is announced that Hulk Hogan is taking the spot. And on January 23rd, Hulk Hogan beats the Iron Sheik. So Sheik is the link between Backlund and Hogan, who would be the person who the national expansion, that was the shoulders it was placed upon. And as the legend went, Vern Gagne put up this sum of whether it was $75,000 or $100,000, telling Iron Sheik to break Hulk Hogan's leg. And Iron Sheik went to them and pretty much had the loyalty of the company for the rest of his career by not breaking their Golden Goose's leg for Vern Gagne's attempt to literally cut off the legs of the WWF's plans. So that's kind of Sheik's biggest moment in terms of notoriety. But after that, he had a series of matches with Sergeant Slaughter, including this boot camp match in the spring of 84. That's a really like well-remembered match, a bloody brawl at the Garden. And then he wins the tag titles at the first WrestleMania and sort of has like a decent position with the company up until 1987, when he and Jim Duggan are traveling and they get pulled over. And first of all, Jim Duggan is like drinking and driving and not thinking this is too big of a deal. And also notes that they've been smoking marijuana. And when they go to check the vehicle, they find cocaine in the vehicle as well. And certainly this is not a great look, but the real scandal way is the fact that the two are feuding on television. What are they doing in the same car together? So this was a huge scandal at the time, that this was like blowing the doors off of professional wrestling, that the Iron Sheik, the evil foreigner, and the All-American Jim Duggan are caught together, and 3 grams of coke are found belonging to the Iron Sheik, who would end up he would get probation, but the charges would get dropped. But this was a really bad deal for Jim Duggan, who, Sheik would be eventually let go as a result of this. And Duggan they would stop using him as well. But Duggan, like his father was the New York police chief. So this is right in that area. And so very embarrassing that here the police chief's son, who's this national television star, is arrested in this fashion, like a really bad look. And Duggan always felt like, yes, the company brought him back, but they never pushed him to the same degree they did, whether it was just they couldn't trust him, and they would always keep him as an over babyface, but he always felt like this really derailed his career in terms of being that number 2 babyface underneath Hogan, of where he felt his ceiling was. But, Sheik would get many opportunities with the company, and he would bounce around. He came back to the company in 88. Then he flipped over, did dates in AEWA, went to WCW for 2 years, which was the Jim Herd era. And towards the end, when Ole Anderson was booking, and was a real mismatch where he did not really fit in with where that company was going. And I guess if you want to look at his last significant run, if you can call it that, he is brought back by the company, by WWF, in early 1991, but not as the Iron Sheik, because the U.S. doesn't have any problems with Iran at this point. They have problems with Iraq. So now he's an Iraqi sympathizer, and he is Colonel Mustafa, that is attached with Sergeant Slaughter and General Adnan. And this would be the focus of that year's SummerSlam. And they rode this thing out. This was a very controversial story in 1991, when they felt that they were exploiting the Gulf War. And so Mustafa got a year out of this character. and then would continue to bounce around the indies. Came back to the WWF in '96 to manage the Sultan with Bob Backlund, and would pop up many times. He did the gimmick battle royal, which famously he had to win because he couldn't take the bump over the top rope, so he won by default. And then the rest was just he had one more match like years later, but it was like he was mainly a guy that was doing the convention circuit and independent appearances. But probably the most significant story that affected him was in May of 2003 when his oldest daughter, Marissa, was murdered by her boyfriend. And this was a horrific story where from the sounds of it, like she had ended things with him and then he strangled her to death. And he ended up being charged and was found guilty. But this, just wrecked this guy, as you could imagine, like for your daughter to be murdered like this. And this was covered in the A&E documentary, and the story had gone around for a while, but from all like sides of the family, like Iron Sheik had a plan that when the former boyfriend was being sentenced, like he either was planning or actually did bring a razor blade into the courthouse hidden in his mouth, like the wrestlers would, and he was going to slit this guy's throat in the courthouse, which would have been just an insane story, similar to like the Cain Velasquez story in some ways of something you can absolutely not condone, but could you understand it? Maybe. So anyway, it was a devastating event in his life. And sadly, like throughout the 2000s, of course, he was not shy about like the drug use. Like he was addicted to crack cocaine. He had lost his money, and he was put out like where he had this whole second life as just this wild character that would come on and cut promos on Hulk Hogan and B. Brian Blair and act crazy, and people would bring him on for like entertainment value. And sometimes it was very sad to watch when this guy, he became like featured on Howard Stern all over the place outside of just professional wrestling. And then it seemed like it was finally his wife left him, and then he got clean in these last few years, and did have two other daughters that he is survived by, along with 5 grandchildren. But many people are going to remember the outlandish character of the Iron Sheik, which, I mean, it had its lows. And I would say in terms of the more positive side of it was that Hall of Fame speech in 2005. That was probably among the most entertaining Hall of Fame speeches when he got up there and just kept going and going. And it was a pretty damn entertaining speech when he was inducted into the WWE Hall of Fame.
A terrifically colorful character in the world of professional wrestling who will be tremendously missed. And, I have to eternally thank him for giving us that soundbite at the end of Review Away / Rewind Away, which we continue to use to this day. So, a huge loss. Yeah,
absolutely. If you want to learn more, yes, the A&E piece came out just recently. It was just on this last run of the season of documentaries. But he also had a documentary called The Sheik that came out in 2014 that the Megans, who were very, very tight with him, helped put together. And it's an excellent documentary if you want to check that out as well. So rest in peace to the Iron Sheik, who has passed away at the age of 81.